You mentioned this idea that the aim of science, you could say, is to explain, predict, and control the phenomenon that you're studying. And in addition to that, do you think that there's any requirement for any understanding of consciousness to be intuitively satisfying? Should we get some intuitive insight into how consciousness emerges from matter, or is that just we don't need that?
This is a really good question. It's something I've actually been thinking about just today, because I've been writing a piece on panpsychism, which is one of the other big positions in the metaphysics of consciousness, which I don't really subscribe to. Not because it's definitively wrong, I just don't think it's very useful. And so panpsychism is this idea that consciousness is somehow fundamental and or ubiquitous in the universe. And it's a view that's motivated by, in large part, by people thinking that a materialist explanation of consciousness is going to be inadequate. The same motivation that underlies the heart problem. So why would people think that it is going to be inadequate? And I think part of that suspicion is indeed that even if we could explain and predict and control by intervening in the brain, in this case, conscious experiences, their phenomenology, their experiential quality to an arbitrary degree of detail, maybe that still wouldn't feel like it's good enough. We're still missing something. We're still missing, like, well, why does it still feel like something to be me? This hard problem mystery might still bug at us. So there are two options. A, in fact, that hard problem mystery will dissolve completely, or it's still there a little bit. And if it's still there a little bit, there could be two reasons for that. One is that, in fact, there's still something we don't understand. There's still a scientific question to be asked, or a different metaphysical stance we have to take. Or it could be, indeed, that we're somehow setting a higher bar for consciousness than we are reasonably entitled to, that it should be intuitively satisfying in a way that we generally don't ask of other scientific enterprises. It's always nice when things are intuitively satisfying. But some aspects of science just aren't. Like quantum mechanics is a great example of a very, very successful science that doesn't even qualify as being intuitively satisfying because nobody can agree what it means. But it works. And it may be incomplete, who knows, but it's doing a really, really good job. And so it may be, but we kind of, well, we care about that, but we don't get too upset about it because it's not us. I think we get more upset about, we want an explanation of consciousness to be intuitively satisfying to a different standard because it is us. And that's just, I think, a little bit unfair on what a science of consciousness should be expected to deliver. Hopefully it will be intuitive, but it might not be.
Yeah, I share your instinct that I agree that panpsychism doesn't really offer a solution, in that you seem to just be saying, well, it's just there. It's just there from the beginning in some way. So you don't really, there's kind of nothing to see here. It's already there. So you don't have to do any chipping away to understand why consciousness exists. And also you also have Mysterianism, right? The idea that it's just utterly beyond our capacities to understand the place of consciousness in nature. And that also seems a bit kind of fatalistic to me, a bit too, taking the hard problem a bit too seriously. And so that's why it's nice that you spending year after year doing actual experimental work, chipping away at this problem, the real problem, instead of taking this kind of very quick solution, right, one way or the other.
That's right. I think there are all these different isms in the philosophy of mind when it comes to consciousness, like panpsychism, we've just talked about a little bit, Mysterianism associated with Colin McGinn. I think, if anything, is even less appealing to me because it does basically just advocate giving up and going home. It's like all these positions, it's not obviously refutable. There may be things that we humans cannot understand, even through incremental methods of building knowledge, like the methods that science gives us. That could be the case. There are some things that frogs can't understand. That we can understand. There are some things that some humans can understand that I can't understand, many things that humans can understand that I can't understand. But to preemptively include consciousness in this sort of species-specific ocean of ignorance is just not very helpful. It doesn't give you anything to do. And there are actually some people out there, I'm thinking of the physicist David Deutsch, who claims that in fact nothing is in principle beyond human understanding. We've reached some sort of universal level of universal cognitive competence, just as in the same way that once you've got a universal Turing machine, there is nothing that is incomputable anymore. Or rather, all things that are computable can be computed by a Turing machine. Now, I don't know whether that's the case for us and cognitive understanding, but all the same, there is really nothing to be gained from Mysterianism, besides, I think, some valid sort of human modesty that there are things that are complicated to understand. We shouldn't endow ourselves with some godlike ability to immediately grasp everything.
Right. And it's mentioning all these different isms in the philosophy of mind. Would your ism be physicalism or materialism that you'd align with?
Yeah, basically. Although I do treat these things kind of informally and loosely, because I think they're ways of thinking. For me, they're what's the most pragmatic view to take. So I'm not going to rest on sort of philosophical thought experiment type arguments that try to either show that materialism must be the case or that materialism must be false or something else. But for me, it's the most pragmatic way to proceed. We can study the brain as a physical object through the tools of science and the technologies that we have. And then relating that to first-person data about what conscious experiences are like, that gives us something to do. And that's the real problem. That's not a new thing, right? People have been doing this for a long time. It's a large part of psychology anyway. When you focus on the phenomenological properties of perception, like what distinguishes one experience from another, then there are approaches that I've been very motivated by. People like Francisco Varela and Evan Thompson talk about neurophenomenology, which is basically the same thing. How do we relate neural mechanisms to properties of experience? So there's a lot of precedent for this. And you can kind of do this pretty much whatever your metaphysical stance might be, but I think it just aligns most naturally with basic materialist, physicalist stance.
Right. And your particular kind of approach to the neuroscience of consciousness, perhaps one of the most famous approaches is the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. But I feel like your research program is slightly different. It seems to be digging a bit deeper in terms of making predictions about what we might observe based on with some kind of theoretical basis. How would you compare your research program to the neural correlates of consciousness research program?
I think it's part of it, but it's sort of an evolution of it. So the neural correlates of consciousness program was historically very, very important. It kicked off, usually identified with people like Francis Crick and Christoph Koch in the early 1990s. And a large part of the historical context there was in the early 1990s. And I know this because I was doing my undergrad at the time and interested in consciousness, but it wasn't being taught in psychology or even physics courses or in natural science, was sort of to push back against the idea that consciousness research is a purely philosophical endeavor or maybe a medical problem or medical issue. That there is a simple experimental approach one can take, which isn't going to give you the answer to the hard problem or to any of the deep problems about consciousness, but nonetheless is useful. You get people, you put them in a brain scanner, you do things like you keep their sensory input the same, but their conscious experience changes. This happens in things like binocular rivalry, when you show two different images, one to each eye. Sensory stimulation remains constant, but your perceptual experience flips back and forth. So you can immediately ask the question, what happens in the brain when your perception changes, but your sensory input doesn't? That would be a candidate neural correlate of consciousness. And since the 1990s, this has been a hugely productive line of work to to pursue. And there are still lots of ongoing debates about, are the main neural correlates of consciousness in the front of the brain or in the back of the brain, or maybe even in the brain stem, or maybe all over the place. The cerebellum never gets a look in, by the way. That seems to be forever excluded. But the neural correlates of consciousness, just limited to trying to find strict correlations, is limited, because, as we all know, correlations are not the same things as explanations, nor do correlations establish causal relationships. And so you get these unsatisfying things where, even if we knew that the neural correlate of visual consciousness was in fact in the posterior cortical hot zone and not in the prefrontal cortex, or maybe the other way around, how much have we really learned? We've learned a lot, but we haven't. Just allocating this area or that area is the beginning of a story rather than the end of the story. We want to know, well, why that region? What process is that region involved in? And it's not going to be limited to one region. It's going to be processes spread out across multiple regions. So there's a pressure in general in the neural correlates of consciousness line of work to go beyond correlation towards explanation. And so one way to think about the real problem approach is finding explanatory correlates of consciousness. So it's not arbitrary when you say this process in the brain or this region in the brain is associated with this kind of conscious experience. You begin to have an understanding of why and when, and you can, as you say, predict what an experience might be given some activity somewhere. And as we go towards explanation from correlation, then I think this approach becomes, as you say, it chips away at the hard problem, little by little, more each time we can do something like that. And there are many ways to do this, and the way that I've been advocating for several years now is through, well, a number of ways, but probably my favorite way is by thinking of the brain as a prediction machine and trying to understand how perceptual predictions that the brain generates, or we hypothesize generates, might account for properties of conscious perception.